And yeah, here's my disclosure page. I unfortunately am a financial idiot, so I don't have anything to disclose. All right, I want to start out by saying, well, Craving has had a big year this year. As many of you are aware, the word or the symptom craving has made it into the DSM-5 list of criteria for substance use and abuse. And since I've been studying craving for a long time, I've been asked to spend some time talking about that. But also, I've been asked to deal with a lot of odds and ends that probably nobody else was willing to talk about. And that includes definitions. And so a few definitions just so that we all understand each other. And the terms liking, wanting, craving, and reward all sound familiar to everyone in this room, although they're frequently misused. Now, liking actually is pretty easy. You say, I like the flavor or taste of a food. Most people say taste. They should really say flavor, but we won't get into that. I would use liking and pleasantness interchangeably. Okay, so pleasure, liking. Reward is a little more complicated. This is where people get into a lot of trouble. People frequently talk about, say, the old Olds and Milner study back in the 1950s, where rats were implanted with electrodes in the medial forebrain bundle, and they bar pressed like crazy to get this electrical stimulation, which caused dopamine release. So this was called interchangeably in these papers the reward circuit and the pleasure circuit. Dopamine was called the pleasure or reward transmitter. But I remind you, going back to the middle of the 20th century, that the behaviorist definition of reward, it's circular, but it's that which increases the behavior that precedes it. It makes no reference to pleasure. And in fact, although pleasure certainly is rewarding, there are other pathways to reward that may not be pleasurable. And one example of that would be the calories absorbed from a meal that may play a role in post-ingestional learning. Then we get to wanting, also a troublesome term. I equate wanting and desire. I would use them interchangeably. And then there's the term incentive salience that Kent Berridge uses frequently. What I would say is that as a result of being paired with reward, objects acquire incentive salience and become desired. Everybody get that? Craving is a very strong desire. Okay? Now, I couldn't resist putting this in, even though, because it just blew me away when I first saw this picture. Back in the 1960s, there weren't a lot of psychoactive medications available to treat various types of disorders, and so whatever came along, people tried to see if it would have any effect. And a fellow named Heath implanted self-stimulation electrodes in a handful of patients. Now, everybody says to me, exactly where were these electrodes? I don't know. Remember, this is in the olden days, this is an X-ray. So we're looking at the front of the face. Where's the pointer? Okay. Wrong end. Okay, eye sockets, electrodes, they're in the base of the brain somewhere. people implanted with these electrodes, like rats, pressed for stimulation incessantly. And again, when Heath wrote about this, he talked about the pleasure circuit. But if you look very, very carefully at what the patients said, they said that the stimulation felt strange. Yes, they were compelled to press the button. They didn't really know why. But they didn't say that this was an orgasmic experience. Although they did, speaking of reward, they did develop some inappropriate attractions to lab personnel. So it was a very entertaining paper to read. Unfortunately, we wouldn't be allowed to do things like this today. But so pleasure and reward, I just want to emphasize again, are not the same thing. Desire and liking are not the same thing. It's well known that drug addicts talk about craving the drug, even after they've ceased to enjoy this. And even cigarette smokers, you don't have to be a cocaine addict to have experienced this. As a former smoker, there were a lot of cigarettes that I craved and didn't really get much out of. And this can happen with food as well. People, we think that people only crave delicious things. And for the most part, that's true. But think about movie theater popcorn. Everybody knows that that is terrible, right? It's too salty. It's got fake butter on it these days. Even the topping that you can put on it, that's some kind of oil, isn't butter anymore. It's dreadful. It costs a lot of money, and yet the majority of people who go into movie theaters pay way too much money for way too much of this stuff, and they eat the whole thing. If you couldn't buy popcorn when you walked in there, you would be surrounded by other people eating it. By the smell of it, you'd have this history, this habit of having bought it before, and you'd crave it. People crave oatmeal for breakfast. If you eat oatmeal every day, now oatmeal isn't chocolate cake, it's not foie gras, but if you eat oatmeal every day and you look in the cabinet and it's not there, you might crave it. We've been able to train people to crave a vanilla-flavored dietary supplement beverage, which isn't dreadful, but isn't great either. Deliciousness is not necessary for craving. It may contribute, but it's not necessary. Now, the most commonly used definition for food craving, and this is what you see in the DSM-5 without the word food in there, is that it's an intense desire to eat a particular food. Two parts of this definition that are important is that the desire be intense. I mentioned that earlier. It's something you'd go out of your way for. But specificity is also important in craving. And as you'll see later, when people are experiencing a food craving, there's a sensory memory that's been evoked, a template, if you will, that has to be matched in order for the craving to be satisfied. So in craving, specificity is important. Now, I've been asked to comment on cross-cultural generalizability, and of course, there hasn't been that much cross-cultural research on craving. We do know that some languages do not have that specific word, and Hormez and Rosin claim that maybe that means that craving is just manufactured by self-indulgent Americans. However, they also say that if you give this if you ask people, have you ever had an intense desire to eat a specific food, something that you go out of your way for, people say, oh yeah, I recognize that. Even if they are from a culture that doesn't have the word craving in its language. So, another important point, this graph comes from my work, but many others have found the same sort of thing. This comes from a structured interview study where we had young adults, 18 to 35 years of age, and older adults, 65 years of age and older, females and males. And as you can see, cravings are normal. Okay, among young women, close to 100% of them reported having had at least one craving in the past year. There's a gender difference among young adults, but even old men who are like humans except they don't do anything, over 60% of them well, obviously, you're not that old. Over 60% of them were willing to admit to having a food craving or two. So cravings are normal, and the point is that if you're in the food industry and you're worried about journalists saying, oh my God, people crave your food, you're responsible for the obesity epidemic, you can say, well, cravings are not pathological in and of themselves, obviously. All right, early in my career in studying cravings, I wanted to go beyond the usual questionnaire or interview study. I wanted to be able to make cravings happen, bring them into the laboratory, come up with an experimental method. And also, I was interested in the commonly held assumption that cravings reflect, again, wisdom of the body, and that they're triggered by nutritional deficits. And I was surprised to find that there's relatively little evidence for this. But you can see why people like this idea, because they can say, oh, I'm craving potato chips, better eat some before I get a cramp in my leg, craving chocolate, I must be magnesium deficient. They've read about that in all the women's magazines. So I wanted to see whether just by boring or restricting people, I could make them have cravings. And I won't go through all of the details of this, but this was a 3-week study. During the baseline and recovery periods, people could eat whatever they wanted to eat. During what we called the monotony manipulation, but this could just be restriction, not monotony. So we could use NIH funding to look into that further. During baseline and recovery, they could eat whatever they wanted. During the monotony manipulation, all that they could consume was a vanilla-flavored dietary supplement beverage. We made sure, though, that they got all the calories they needed. They couldn't believe that they were in an experiment where the point was not to lose weight. So they weren't allowed to lose weight. They got their RDAs of all of their macro and micronutrients, okay? So they're not nutritionally deprived during the monotony manipulation. Every day they filled out a questionnaire that had asked them about food cravings in the past 24 hours, but we tried to conceal our intent by asking them about other things as well, like exercise, sleep, and so on. And so what we have here is average number of cravings per day, and we have the same groups, young and older adults, females and males. And if you look at the red and white bars, which are the young adults, you can see that there is a big increase, a very significant increase in food cravings during the monotony manipulation as compared to baseline and recovery. We did not see this in older adults, but I will say, and this is a topic for another conference, there are a lot of changes in all kinds of regulatory behaviors in older adults, be it body temperature regulation, fluid balance, food intake, and so on. But this is a very robust effect that's been replicated many, many times, at least in young adults. So nutritional deprivation, at least, isn't necessary to produce food cravings. But referring back to Steve's talk, being hungry may contribute, for example. I'm not going to go into a lot of detail here, but people who have a lot of cravings do tend to be fatter, they snack more, have more trouble staying on diets, and they are more likely to binge eat or be bulimic. Okay, this, of course, is straying outside of my area, and I have to admit a slight influence of Mark Friedman here, but craving seems to be associated with non-homeostatic eating. People who have food cravings, they express fear of loss of control in the presence of craved foods. Now, I don't think that loss of control is part of craving. And in fact, when we make these manipulations that make cravings go up, loss of control is already so high that it doesn't go anywhere for those foods. So there may be some relationship, but in any case, craving contributes somehow or is related to non-homeostatic eating. As Steve said, we have this homeostatic model, but really it's sort of like having a house with a heater and an air conditioner. And the heater works pretty well. So when people feel hungry, they consider it to be an emergency, unless they're a fashion model, in which case they've trained themselves to not treat hunger as an emergency. But people defend vigorously against caloric deficit. Now, once calories are stored as fat, although there are signals that come from fat stores, overweight people don't seem to be very responsive to them. So once calories are stored as fat, they're ignored. They're not part of the daily equation. Sure, you can mobilize some fat stores, but for the most part, that stuff that's sitting on your belly or your thighs, wherever you happen to keep yours, isn't seen. And so if you do make these tiny errors and overeat and develop fat stores, you're not going to fully compensate for that. And I think that, again, for years, people interested in treating obesity have focused on keeping patients from feeling hungry. And of course, that's important. You don't want to, people walking around feeling like they're starving. That probably does make it more difficult to diet. But that does not solve the whole problem, because most of our eating is non-homeostatic. I agree with Steve that there is a final common pathway, and I'll talk about that in a second. Okay, well, so I had a way of making cravings happen in a laboratory setting. So one of the things that I did with this was an fMRI study in almost the dawn of fMRI. What you see here are various types of brain sections. For those of you who aren't brain jockeys, the first one's the horizontal section, second one's sagittal, and the third one is coronal. And what you see here are areas of activation associated with food craving. And the first two, the hippocampus and the insula, are memory related. Everybody knows hippocampus and memory. Insula, the activation we saw was in the middle and posterior insula, and these areas are involved in memory for what it feels like to do something. Okay, so you can see how that would be important in food craving. And then we also have the caudate nucleus. That's dorsal striatum. In a lot of animal studies, the reward area is nucleus accumbens, which is ventral striatum. Why are we seeing activation in the caudate? Well, this is a more recent study from a group at the Montreal Neurological Institute, where they combined PET and fMRI. So they were able to show that given the same task, the activation that you see on fMRI, and notice here's caudate again, dorsal striatum, the activation that you see in the fMRI is in fact dopaminergic based on the PET raclopride binding work. And what they found was during anticipation of reward, the activation was in dorsal striatum, but during and after receipt of the reward, it was in ventral striatum. So what kind of reward were these guys using? And you'll hear a lot more about the fact that you can see the same pattern of activation for food cravings and drug cravings, and so, you know, does that make food evil and so forth? Well, the stimulus here is music. Subjects were listening to familiar pieces of music, and so they could anticipate when their favorite part, the part that gave them chills, was coming up. And so the caudate, the dorsal striatal activation was right before the big cymbal crash, and the nucleus accumbens activation was after. But, okay, so the point of showing this particular slide is to say that, you know, you only have one body. You have to decide what to do with it. And desires of many kinds are going to use the same final common pathway. And so, yes, drugs of abuse are able to stimulate this substrate more strongly and more rapidly, which may be important as well, than natural rewards can. But a lot of very innocuous pleasures or rewards, in this case they're probably both, use the same substrate. So just because you see this pattern of activation does not mean that you have, you know, something evil going on. Also, when I did this study, a lot of people congratulated me on finally getting away from self-report. You know, they said, oh, well, now you can use fMRI to know when people were having cravings. And yeah, sure, you might be able to do that. It's pretty cumbersome and expensive. But how did we know that that pattern of activation had anything to do with food craving? Well, of course, we asked people. And ultimately, all nonverbal measures and all animal models have to be validated against self-report. So, you know, craving is a psychological experience, like the color pink or the taste or sweetness. The only way we can have access to that, really, is to ask. Okay, and I already said that. So, craving. Craving is not a matter of nutritional deficit. I think that learning plays a very large part in craving. And people in the drug addiction field have been talking about this for years. The classic story is that a person goes to rehab, weathers withdrawal, a physiological response to not having the whatever substance around, goes out into the real world. Oh, and incidentally, in the DSM-4, it was assumed that craving was a symptom of withdrawal. But then what happens is people who have gotten over withdrawal go back out into the real world, into the old neighborhood, encounter environmental cues associated with substance use, and they say, without thinking, almost without thinking, they begin using again. They also experience some craving, okay? So just as withdrawal is not necessary for drug craving, a nutritional deficit is not necessary to produce food cravings. It's very clear that stimuli in the environment can trigger food cravings. The sight and smell of food, you know, it's no accident that you smell those cinnamon buns in the shopping mall. Jim's Steaks in Philadelphia has the biggest line in the city, although I don't think it's the best cheesesteak place in Philadelphia, but they pump good smells out there. So in any case, external cues do trigger craving, and there is evidence that cravings can be learned, and sadly, it seems to be a very simple mechanism. You repeatedly eat a food. Yikes. Okay, so I was asked to talk about what does food addiction mean, and I'm sure others will go through this, but okay, there's a trivial sense. Everybody needs to eat, so sure, we're addicted to food the way we're addicted to air. Well, that's not interesting. But do people who might qualify as food addicts have a disordered response to all foods? Maybe. One type of food, well, yeah, there are people who say I'm a sweet addict, or I'm a, I don't know, and then there are people who say I'm a chocolate addict, you know, so one type of food. What does tolerance mean with food? Who knows? Some people say it means that you need more and more, bigger and bigger portions as time goes by. But as a gastronome, I might argue that it means that you need better and better food as time goes by. So when you're a little kid, you're willing to eat chocolate that's really made out of wax, and when you get older and you've encountered Belgian chocolate, you won't eat the waxy stuff anymore. What qualifies as dysfunction? Of course, the criteria are vague, and they're vague for food, and they're vague for drugs as well, frankly. Okay, so DSM-5 criteria, it's no longer called addiction or dependence. I think it's called substance use and dependence, or substance use and abuse. Okay, what is it? Substance use disorder. Okay. In any case, as I said, craving is in there. Just quickly, if you look at some of these criteria, some seem silly for food, but certainly taken in larger amounts or over a longer period than intended, things like that do resonate with the failed dieter. If you get an image of an overweight person who's failed at dieting, some of them would qualify for food addiction if that were an accepted diagnostic category. Right now, the feeling was that it wasn't necessary, that in fact binge eating covers food addiction. I don't think that's correct. Not all obese people are binge eaters. Also, what does food addiction explain? Does food addiction explain the obesity epidemic? No. Food addiction, in this case, if you look at the DSM-5, is a diagnosis. The diagnosis is based on negative consequences of certain behaviors. So food addiction doesn't cause anything. It's a diagnosis that you get as a result of behaving maladaptively. So we have to look at what kinds of behaviors are maladaptive. And I think we know, what many of them are, and we need to learn how to modify those behaviors. Another important point, it's commonly assumed that there are certain types of foods that are responsible for, quote, food addiction. And certainly we're built to like sugar. And chocolate and pizza, though, are at the top of most craving lists in the US and Western Europe. But what is craved does vary with culture. People crave what they eat. But we don't know what the critical characteristic is. I've talked about palatability. Calories might be necessary. I don't know if I could get people to crave celery. Sometimes people say they crave celery, and I say, what was on it? And they'll say, cream cheese with walnuts or peanut butter or something like that. Fat and sugar are candidates, and maybe just being forbidden contributes to craving. But this is important from a policy point of view, because if it is a substance that's responsible for these maladaptive behaviors, then we are justified in getting rid of that substance or taxing it or whatever. But the fact is, we don't know. And of course, there are studies out of Bart Hobel's lab and Rebecca Corwin's lab with rats that suggest that if they have intermittent access to sugar or fat, they begin, even though they have other food available, they begin to binge on those substances. So could it be, that's an example of the way that food is used. Could it be just the way that food is used? For example, restrained eating. Restrained eaters eat less of certain foods than they would like to. And this, they go on and off diets. Restrained eating, paradoxically, can be associated with overeating. And perhaps these people are giving themselves the same treatment as rats had. This has recently been proposed as the explanation for the big increase in sushi craving among Japanese women, that they are restricting, and maybe that's why they're craving. And incidentally, sushi, although it does have complex carbohydrate, it's pretty easily turned into sugar, but it's not sweet. So anyway, so there are a whole lot of parallels between food craving and drug craving. Should we be hysterical? I would say no. Craving is normal. I think that we should just borrow from drug treatment programs. and use some of the techniques that they use, go back to the good old-fashioned behavior modification techniques. If desire for food in the absence of hunger is triggered by cues in the environment, reduce the salience of those cues. You know, don't leave the peanuts on the counter, put them in the cabinet. That way you won't eat one every time you go by and gain, 5 pounds in a year instead of 1. So all of these, I won't go through them in great detail because I have 0 time left. What about prohibition? Should we get rid of sugary drinks? Well, prohibition didn't work all that well with alcohol. So, we'd have speakeasies for candy, and people would be sneaking up to Canada to eat it and things like that. So what I would say is that maybe rather than prohibition, we should have economic incentives, make healthy foods more readily available, make them cheaper, literally use the carrot instead of the stick. So I will stop there. I hope all of you can see Skin Patch Man. If not, this is a Rosalind Chaz cartoon. You can't give a talk without a New Yorker cartoon. It came out when the nicotine patch came on the market. So she has, for nicotine, alcohol, throwing away money on the ponies, torrid, meaningless flings, bacon cheeseburgers, salt, and sweets. We might now argue that that could be all one patch, but in any case, that's it.